In case you've never heard of it, the gay panic defense is defined on Wikipedia as a legal strategy in which a defendant claims to have acted in a state of violent temporary insanity, committing assault or murder because of unwanted same-sex sexual advances, typically from men. A defendant may allege to have found the same-sex sexual advances so offensive or frightening that they were provoked into reacting, were acting in self-defense, were of diminished capacity, or were temporarily insane, and that this circumstance is mitigating. The gay panic defense's origin is in the archaic mental disorder homosexual panic, coined by psychiatrist Edward Kempf in 1920, where he described it as a condition of panic due to the pressure of uncontrollable, perverse sexual cravings. Kempf and others studied this condition in detail and noticed that symptoms of it were dizziness, nausea, and vomiting, seemingly in disgust at their own interests, as well as hallucinations and delusions of persecution when their behavior was found out. The people diagnosed with homosexual panic never acted aggressively towards the objects of their desire, but rather blamed themselves for their own cravings. Kempf's homosexual panic is no longer recognized as a disorder. And to me, it just sounds like somebody's in the closet. But it became briefly well known just enough to inspire the gay panic defense. Even though when homosexual panic was still considered a disorder, it never once led to violence against the object of desire. Though the gay panic defense and the associated trans panic defense are extremely high-profile topics online, they haven't actually been successfully invoked all that often in Western countries. That's not to say that people haven't tried to invoke it, they try regularly, but it usually gets shut down pretty quick. And when it is successful, it rarely ends with a not guilty verdict, but rather it's a mitigating circumstance which lessens the sentence. Like the guy in New Zealand in 2009 who killed a man by shoving a banjo down his throat. Yes, really. His charge was dropped from murder to manslaughter due to the gay panic defense, though he was still hit with 12 years in prison. All of this setup brings us to this headline. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this name. Esemene Etute, acquitted of mistaken gender identity murder of Tinder date. This is currently going viral because of the widespread belief that the victim was trans, and that Etute's defense relied on the trans panic defense, a variation of gay panic that, to my knowledge, has never actually been successfully invoked in a Western country, though you do hear about it used in the third world. Let's go over the case. Etute was, at the time of the event, an 18-year-old football player for Virginia Tech. He contacted a woman named Angie on Tinder, who offered to pay him $50 to give him a blowjob in a dark alley, which he accepted. I gotta say, maybe it's because Etute is a dumb kid or something, but you've gotta hear that sus alarm ringing if you get paid to get head in a dark alley where you can't see the other person's face. That was on April 10th, 2021. Etute had another date scheduled with Angie on May 31st. Angie had also asked Etute to try and hook her up with other members of the Virginia team, and at least one of the guys who accompanied Etute to the apartment also had a date with her that night. Etute would later say that he wanted backup in case something weird went on, because he suspected that Angie might not be a woman. When Etute went in, the lights were off. Angie said it was because she was a well-known figure in the medical community and didn't want to be recognized outside of anonymous sexual encounters. They were preparing to have anal sex when Etute decided to touch Angie's genitals and discovered a penis. Etute then shined the light from his phone onto Angie's face, and upon seeing a masculine face, asked, "Why didn't you tell me you were a dude?" At this point, Angie reached underneath the mattress. Etute would later testify that he believed she was reaching for a weapon in order to kill him, now that she had been found out. And the police would in fact recover a knife from underneath the mattress. This fear that Angie would get the weapon and kill Etute would form the basis for his self-defense claim. But the force Etute used against Angie was, in my opinion, extreme for the circumstance. Etute would punch Angie 5 times in the face and stomp on her head at least twice. Etute is a college athlete, 6'2", I think, and had at least 50 pounds on his target. Angie was 40 years old and petite. If Etute genuinely feared for his life, surely you wouldn't need that much force to temporarily debilitate an attacker and then run to your 2 waiting friends outside. Most of the bones in Angie's face were broken, and several teeth were knocked out. Etute later testified that he heard a gurgling sound coming from Angie, but didn't think the beating was that bad and left. Medical examiners during the trial would later point out stains on the closet door where Angie would spew massive amounts of blood, and the blood frothing on the lips and chin of the body proved that Angie could not breathe through the amount of blood pouring out of her face. However, what also came out during the trial was that Angie was actually Jerry Paul Smith, a 40-year-old man who was, per his social media accounts, not trans, but instead openly gay and actively involved in the city's gay scene. he would cross-dress as Angie and talk younger straight men into letting him give them blowjobs in circumstances where it would be hard to discover that he was a cross-dressing man. The Angie catfish was apparently well known in the area. Jerry Paul Smith worked for a chain of local Mexican restaurants, and he can be seen on local TV several years before the incident talking about issues unrelated to this event, where he is addressed as Mr. Smith. To me, that doesn't make this a trans panic thing. I don't think he was trans. However, everybody's saying trans panic on social media because, I don't know, I guess he cross-dressed and there's a weird segment of terminally online people who think that cross-dressing is trans now? Maybe some people think that he was closeted trans, that's more of a possibility? I don't know. But in my opinion, no, there's no trans panic here, regardless of what the internet says. However, the gay panic defense, we actually have to get into that. In February of 2021, Virginia banned the gay and trans panic defenses with House Bill number 2132. The relevant passages read, A. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, the discovery of, perception of, or belief about another person's actual or perceived sex, gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation, whether or not accurate, is not a defense to any charge of capital murder, murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, or voluntary manslaughter, and is not a provocation negating malice as an element of murder. B. Nothing in this section shall preclude the admission of evidence of a victim or witness's conduct, behavior, or statements that is relevant and otherwise admissible. You'll notice that the law is written neutrally, meaning that as it bans gay and trans panic, it also bans cis and straight panics, as unlikely as those would be. You'll also notice the second part, where the law makes allowances regarding evidence that is otherwise admissible, even if that evidence relates to gender or sexuality. In other words, while the law states that being misled or confused about the gender or sexuality of another person is not a defense if you kill them, that doesn't mean that issues of gender or sexuality are automatically off the table. Let's give the argument the maximum possible benefit of the doubt. If Smith were a trans woman, as Angie, then conceivably Smith could say the phrase, "I'm a woman," and it would be technically correct because she didn't specify what type of woman she is, trans or cis. And if that's the case, if Etute went into the encounter expecting a cis woman, got a trans woman, and then freaked out, let's forget about Smith going for the knife for a minute. If that's the case, then the subsequent violence could absolutely be a trans panic incident. Meaning, by the way, that Etute is morally repugnant because you shouldn't kill people for that kind of reason, and also any claiming of a trans panic would be against the law. But if Smith wasn't trans, but was in fact a gay man who cross-dressed specifically to entrap straight men into having sexual encounters with him, believing he's a woman, then the waters are a lot more muddy. In this instance, Smith is committing some form of sexual assault, and is also pretty morally repugnant. A detective who took the stand in the case did say, independent of other factors, if he knew about Smith's conduct, he would have brought him in on charges of procuring sex under false pretenses, which is a form of sexual assault under Virginia law. Does this count as a gay panic defense that would be disallowed under the new law, though? I'm not sure. That section B that allows relevant evidence might come into play in this interpretation of the law. In this case, gender or sexuality seems to be a relevant piece of evidence, if the main reason for the dispute between Etute and Smith is that Smith lied about his gender for his sexual pleasure. However, the bulk of the defense's arguments didn't even revolve around a gay panic defense. It revolved around the knife that Smith reached for after being discovered, and how a reasonable person in Etute's shoes would feel threatened enough to use force to escape that situation. The two possible scenarios, one where Smith is gay and the other where Smith is trans, the outcome seems to be the same for both of them. Smith reaches for a knife, Etute feels threatened and uses force in self-defense. In scenario 1, Smith is gay and has purposefully concealed that from Etute, deceiving him, and that deception is relevant. In scenario 2, Smith is trans, and you can make a good faith argument that there was a miscommunication between the two. But ultimately, in either scenario, a gay or trans panic defense isn't actually needed for the defense's argument of self-defense based on fear of the reach of a weapon to hold together. The issue, ultimately, is, was the amount of force Etute used justified? The answer to me is obviously not, considering the extensive injuries. Etute clearly killed Smith. There's no doubt about it. The question up in the air is, did Etute's fear constitute enough of a justification for it to be justified self-defense? I personally don't think it did, but the jury disagreed. The reason that we're even talking about a gay panic defense is because despite the main claim of the defense, the knife grab, headlines like this began to pop up. Ex-college athlete accused of murder pleads not guilty, judge to rule on gay panic defense motion. What's going on here is that anti-gay panic bill that was passed, bill number 2132, it went into force after the incident in question. The defense requested that the judge not instruct the jury on what the bill required of them, and the judge agreed. The bill did not say it applied retroactively, and the judge was quoted as saying it would have been applicable, but this ruling is purely procedural. In other words, ignoring 2132 is not some huge statement by the court on gay panic or anything like that. It's simply following the law. What the actual impact this ruling had on the trial is that when the jury goes into deliberations, they are given a list of rules. It was 25 rules this time. These rules are meant to instruct, in layman's terms, what kinds of things the jury should be considering. For example, one of the rules was details regarding self-defense law. During the trial, the prosecution argued that Smith's act of reaching for the knife didn't constitute an overt enough act to qualify for self-defense, and so the judge included a rule to the jury describing what does and doesn't qualify for self-defense. Because the Gay Panic Ban Bill took effect after the incident in question, what the practical impact on the trial was that the judge didn't include a rule regarding what gay panic is and why it's not applicable to the jury. That's it. The defense didn't even rely on Etute's feelings of being deceived by Smith in their case. That came out in the prosecution's cross-examination, as far as I can tell. The defense's efforts were focused almost entirely on the knife grab, and from what I can see, they didn't even make an overt gay panic defense. That being said, I still don't agree with the ruling. I think that Etute used a disproportionate amount of force, too much for self-defense. And it's actually conceivable that, in a layman's sense of things, once the weapon reach was no longer a pressing issue, once Smith was no longer getting at his knife, Etute allowed himself to get enraged at the fact that he was deceived, and that drove the violence from justified self-defense into murder territory. I can absolutely see that being a possibility. Maybe it's even a likely possibility. The problem is, there was no evidence showing that. And like it or not, we have presumption of innocence for some very good reasons in Western liberal democracies. Consider the inverse hypothetical, since Bill 2132 is neutrally written. In this hypothetical, let's assume that Etute was a gay man hooking up with Smith, who he believed was also a gay man. And let's assume that Smith posed as a gay man online, but actually was a straight woman, deceiving gay men into having sex with her. Etute discovers that Smith is a woman, gets angry, asks, "Why didn't you tell me you were a girl?" In retaliation for being found out, Smith reaches for a knife. Etute fears for his life at this point and then beats her to death and leaves. Do you think that Etute needs a straight panic defense in this scenario? Or does the reaching for a weapon constitute enough justification for self-defense? Or the amount of force Etute used constitutes a murder instead? Either way, straight panic isn't needed to make the determination, and I don't think that gay panic is in the real case either. At least not from a legal point of view. Finally, and this is just a minor point, I'm reminded of that genital reveal Destiny drama from last year. At one point, Destiny said that if you're getting into a sexual encounter with somebody and not revealing the fact that you have a different set of genitals than your partner clearly expects you to have, that is a form of sexual assault. The entire internet lost their minds at him, but he seems to be correct. He also pointed out, equally correctly, that the main reason most trans people don't do that type of thing is because it's incredibly dangerous for them. The story of a straight dude who hits on a hot trans woman, discovers she has a penis, and then he beats her to death in rage is a well-known trope because it does sometimes happen. And maybe that's why everybody's assuming that Smith is trans, rather than a cross-dresser. His story is literally the stereotype of what a trans woman shouldn't do. Not to say I'm blaming Smith, like I said, I think Etute did literally get away with it. Maybe not second-degree murder, the charge he was charged with, since that requires intention and malice. But manslaughter, where the standard is that it's a crime of passion? Abso-fucking-lutely. And the prosecution even admitted in their closing statement that maybe second-degree murder was too much to ask. Anyway, the official dev verdict on this is Etute killed Smith and got away with it. Smith was a sexual assaulter. Smith did reach for a weapon, and Etute did kill him. We don't know if it was accidental or deliberate, but if it was deliberate, then Etute literally got away with murder. And the jury, with a relatively low bar to overcome, sided with accidental. You can disagree with that. I disagree with that. But there was no trans panic defense used, and there was only a gay panic defense used insofar as the jury was not explicitly barred by the judge from considering issues of sexuality on a technicality. The idea that this case is yet another sign that society is turning on LGBT people and that they're soon going to be genocided is just, in my opinion, ridiculous. You're not going to see this happen again in Virginia. If Smith's killing happened today, the subsequent trial would see the judge explicitly bar any gay panic shenaniganery in the jury's instructions. The best case interpretation for the anti-LGBTness of this trial is that homophobes and transphobes squeezed one final false not guilty verdict in at the finish line as the anti-gay panic law comes fully into effect. In that sense, this event is not another step towards the creation of a fully anti-LGBT society, but rather one of the final steps away from it. My final thought is I don't like how this played out. I think Etute was guilty of manslaughter, he got away with it, but I think the internet took a headline and ran with it, massively distorting the facts of the case in the process. There was no trans panic. The only gay panic present was in technical instructions to the jury not explicitly barring it. The defense didn't even use it as far as I can tell, and it doesn't seem to have actually affected the outcome of the case. There was an exceptionally low bar to reach for self-defense, and the defense apparently reached it. Etute got lucky and got away with it. Simple as that. I don't like it, but that's how it is on this bitch of an earth.